Alright, what's up? We got 44 more cards to go, so we're just gonna grind through it, hopefully finish before midnight. Three emotional behavioral effects of stress, anger, anxiety, and addiction. 7 to 11 year is called the stable operational stage, in which children learn about conservation. So if you pour a glass of water into another, like, thinner glass of water, they'll be able to understand that the volume of water in each glass that had water are the same, and they also learn about mathematics. Biological reason for depression is because I had this. I remember this. I think brain secrete. Oh yeah, the uh, anterior starts with a C. Anterior cingula, which is near the anterior frontal cortex, anterior frontal cortex, is unable to respond to serotonin. Anterior cingulate. The cingulate is okay. Cingulate serotonin. That's nice. Cingulate serotonin. Exhaustion is when your body isn't designed to handle high levels of stress. So when you get high levels exhaustion, your body's resources for stress, dealing with stress, is depleted, and your tissues will start to get damaged because, again, our bodies aren't designed to respond to high levels of stress or long-term stress. What is learned helplessness? It's the idea that you learn from not being able to. You learn that from having lost control of something that you don't have control, and therefore that leads you to believe that you don't have the ability to cope with stress. The main symptom of depression is anhedonia, in which you're unable to perceive pleasure, which indicates that you have more stressors. What is limbic system? It's a system for regulating emotions. Hippocat. So hippocampus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and thalamus. Was a Mayer Friedman? So says that heart disease. They did an experiment to test the notion that heart disease is correlated with stress, and they found that people who had heart diseases are also tended to be very angry in nature. Role of the thalamus. So thalamus is this sensory relay station in the limbic system. So it's going to relay all your information from your senses to the appropriate areas of the brain and cortexes, all except for smell, because it bypasses the thalamus. Biological reason for depression is because of the idea that our the anterior cingulate, which is a part of the anterior, is in the anterior of the frontal cortex, is unable to respond to serotonin. Emotional behavioral effect of stress is anxiety, which centers on the amygdala. Once you restore both sides of your amygdala, then you're unable to restore both sides of your amygdala. I think it's like, yeah, Kluver-Bucy syndrome, which is called hyperarousal, hypersexuality, and disinhibited behavior. Kluver-Bucy syndrome result in hyperarousal, hypersexuality, and disinhibited behavior. Kluver-Bucy syndrome. What's the physiological component? Emotional experience. So the physiological component is that your skin will turn up, your face will blush and stuff like that, and you tense up. Cognitive component is that, it varies to the individual. So some people might have had a surprise birthday parties before, so they might enjoy it, and some people don't. They have negative emotional experiences from a surprise party. And the behavioral of an emotional experience is when you give off body language and you do facial expressions. What is essential? It coordinates the visual spatial sketchpad, and the phonologic loop. Yeah. Inattentional blindness is not being aware of some things that are right, not being aware of some things that are right out in front of you. Perceived control. Perceived control. So lack of perceived control associated with higher stress. So people at the bottom of the hierarchy were more stressed. Like peasants. Peasants are more stressed. Lack of perceived control is associated with higher stress. What is the relationship between routes of entry? Faster routes of entry equals higher addictive potential. What are the two divisions? Parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest, and sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. Where taste buds like their vocal structures called papillae. Cones. These receive are able to detect color and motion. Rods detect motion, detect color and detail. What are the 3 ways to cope with stress? Perceived control, optimism, and social support. Perceived control, optimism, and social support. Prefrontal cortex is associated with how you act in social situations, decision making, and executive control. Blabbing, one word, random words in sentences, 3-word max, fully developed sentences. Perceived control. Lack of perceived control is associated with high levels of stress. And researchers found out that when people are at the bottom of a hierarchy, they tend to be more stressed. Conduction aphasia is the inbuilt. This is conduction. It's an issue with the acronym fasciculus, so you're unable to conduct between the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. So conduction aphasia. I think this is pulmonary acronym. Unable to coordinate speaking and understanding activities. Cope with stress. Optimism, perceived control, optimism, and peer bonding. Social support. Yeah. Turns out that we have 7 general intelligences. The role of the hippocampus is involved in memory information, so it stores information, takes information from short-term memory and puts it into long-term memory. You develop schemas through assimilation and accommodation. What is negative priming? Negative priming is when prior exposure decreases our response to stimulus, and positive priming is prior exposure to stimulus increases responses. What are 4 ways to manage stress? No idea. Exercise, meditation, religious belief, cognitive flexibility, and coping. 4 ways to manage. Exercise, meditation, religious belief, cognitive flexibility, and coping. That's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5 ways. Exercise, meditation, religious belief, cognitive flexibility, and coping. Coping with stress. Exercise, meditation, cognitive flexibility, coping, and religion. I'm going to say religion. Easier. Religion. Exercise, meditation, religion, cognitive flexibility, and coping. Okay. Propose that the attenuator can be varied based on the given difficulty of the situation. So if a situation requires lots of attention, then we're able to increase our attenuator, or we can decrease it anytime we want. When you destroy the hippocampus, you're still able to keep short-term memory, you're unable to form new memories, which is anterior amnesia. What is the James Lange theory of emotion? James Lange argues that emotion is argues that emotion is oh man, young boy James Lang argues that emotion, I think it was, yeah, emotion is due to our interpretation of physical responses. So if you pick up a cat, it causes your heart rate to beat, and your body and your brain just recognizes as your heart beating faster as an emotion is like being happy. Yeah, perception, physical responses. Yep, perfect. 5 ways we can manage stress: exercising, meditating, religion, cognitive flexibility, and coping. Proactive coping. Isn't that preparing for a stressful event so you don't get stressed? Yeah, anticipating a difficult challenge and preparing how to cope with it. What are 2 components of the sensory memory register? Oh, I remember this was like iconic component and echo component. Iconic component is when you see. Let's have some here in the last 4 seconds. Vygotsky's theory of language. Language thought is separate from birth, but through socialization, we're able to coordinate the two. What is the Singer theory of emotion? It states that emotion is due to how we label physiological responses. So there's an event, then we get a physiological response, and we label it, which just allows us to determine what emotion we're able to perceive. What is manifest content? So part of Sigmund Freud theory of dreams, manifest content is a literal meaning, and latent content is a symbolic meaning. What is social coping? Social coping is a way to deal with stress in which you meet with your friends. Is driven by oxytocin and peer bonding. Yeah, ways to cope with stress. What is proactive coping? It's anticipating a stressful event and preparing how to cope with it. What are 3 emotional behavioral effects of stress? Anger, anxiety, and addiction. What is the role of the amygdala in the limbic system? Amygdala, anger, emotion, and sex drive. Aggression center, submission will produce anger, violence, fear, anxiety. Yeah, aggression center, mating. Okay, amygdala is the aggression center. Simulation to amygdala produces anger, violence, fear, anxiety. Cannon-Barr theory of emotion disagree with James Lang theory of emotion, saying that I think it was like there's an event, then there's the physiological response, and then no, he states that the physiological response and our interpretation of emotion occurs simultaneously. Yeah, that's hard though. Biology, there's a symptom, or it's when the anterior cingulate, which is located near the anterior of the frontal cortex, stops responding to serotonin. Positive motion evokes more activity on the left side of the brain, while negative motion evokes more activity on the right side of the brain. What happens when you destroy both sides of your amygdala? You destroy your aggression center, so this causes you to get hypersexuality, hyperorality, and disinhibited behavior, which basically you just don't think about the actions of the consequences of your action, which is Kluver-Bucy syndrome. Kluver-Bucy. Emotions are temporary and can be good or bad, very intense. Emotions are involuntary. Part of the ciliary body which secretes aqueous humor. Makes up the ciliary muscles too. What is meaning-focused coping? Person concentrates on meaning-focused coping. Person concentrates on deriving meaning from a stressful experience in order to cope with the stress. Deriving meaning from a stressful experience in order to cope with the stress. What is the Yerkes-Dodson law? It is a bell-shaped curve in which it states that we tend to have optimal performance when we have moderate amounts of emotion. What is the appraisal theory of stress made by Richard? It states that appraisal theory of stress. I forgot. Okay. Stress arises less and more from the interpretation. Overt orienting is shifting your entire body, such as your ear, to a stimuli source, sound source, in order to get better attention. As a foreregion of the brain the VTA sends to PANA. VTA will send to the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, nuclear accumbens, and hippocampus. No, we'll send it to the hypothalamus, hippocampus. Panda, which is hippo. Okay. What does mean? This is deriving meaning from a stressful experience in order to cope with. People who are going to show increase in the right anterior insula, right hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. Cones, they detect color and discern high levels of details from an object. Lazarus theory. Experience of emotion depends on how the situation is appraised or labeled. Experience of emotion depends on how the situation is cognitive. That's how we label, based on cultural. Experience of emotion depends on how the situation is cognitively appraised based on cultural and individual differences. Pragmatics are just the pragmatics. Dependence of language on prior pre-existing knowledge. What is maladaptive coping techniques? Techniques that will just reduce symptoms while maintaining or even strengthening. Techniques that will reduce symptoms while maintaining or even strengthening the actual disorder. Techniques that will reduce symptoms while maintaining or even strengthening. 2 to 7 years is called the pre-operational stage. This is when children are they engage in pretend play. They are centered focus, and they're not able to use symbolism for words. What is perceived control? Perceived control. Lack of perceived control is correlated with high levels of stress, and they found out from research that when you are at a lower hierarchical level, you tend to have more stress. What sort of medication we use to treat tobacco addicts? So you can give them something called methadone, which acts like nicotine. You can give them a transdermal patch that delivers less amounts of nicotine to reduce craving, or you can give them something that mimics nicotine and binds to the adenosine receptors, which reduces cravings. What is a maladaptive coping technique? This is techniques used to reduce symptoms but actually to strengthen the actual disorder. Define each of the following maladaptive. Oof, this is too long. Dissociation is forgetting about the stress. Sensitization is researching. Avoiding the stress at all cost. Running away. Anxious avoid escape just running away. Dissociation, forgetting about it. Sensitization, researching, learning about it before it happens in the first place. It is relying on something like a safety rope to cope with the stress, and avoiding stress at all costs is anxious avoidance and escape stress. What is information processing model? Brings our computers get input, process it, and output. What is distal stimuli? Distal stimuli are just stimuli that are like trees that actually don't interact with their receptors. Reversal theory of language says that thought dictates language. Optimism, socializations like peer bonding, and perceived control. Low effort coping. coping response on a minority group in an attempt to fit into dominant culture. Coping response by minority groups may learn to put in more effort because they're the way minority groups can cope with stress. So, for example, they put in minimal effort because they believe they're being discriminated against by dominant culture. What did Darwin think? Emotion is innate because emotion conferred a survival advantage. Dissociation, forgetting about the stress, sensitization, researching about the stress to prevent from happening in the first place. Safety barriers, relying on something to help you cope with the stress. Ancient avoidance, avoiding the stress, and safe is just running away. Detoxification is when you get rid of the effects of a drug from your body. Decay in human memory is how forgetting happens. Neurons get weaker over time and die off over time, which is why we tend to forget stuff. Process of working memory occurs at these visual spatial sketchpad and at the phonological loop. One or two components of sensory memory register. Iconic component, which is what you see, lasts 1 to 2 seconds, and a co-component, which is what you hear, lasts 3 to 4 seconds. Left percentage is used coping mechanism used by minority groups to fit into a dominant culture, in which minority groups put in minimal effort because they are aware that a culture is dominated by dominant culture. They don't need to put in effort. Is a precursor Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is due to confusion, mild confusion, small memory loss, and poor balance. Role of the amygdala and limbic system is the aggression center, so it deals with anger, aggression, fear, anxiety, all that stuff in the limbic system. Social coping is when you get together with your peers to cope with stress. What are the 5 ways that we can manage stress? Religion, exercise, meditation, cognitive flexibility, and coping. Proactive coping is actually thinking about the stress ahead of time and figuring out how to cope from it ahead of time. Emotions are temporary, can be positive, negative, and emotions are involuntary. The appraisal theory made by Richard Lazarus states that emotions are more or less less due to physical events, or rather due to how we interpret those physiological responses from the events. If you disturb both sides of your amygdala, you develop something called Kluver-Bucy syndrome, in which you develop hypersexuality, hyperorality, and disinhibited behavior, in which you don't think about the consequences of your negative behavior. 4 regions VTA is open to: panda, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, hippocampus, and nuclear accumbens. Mean focus coping, deriving meaning from a stressful event in order to cope with it. Lazarus theory says that we perceive emotion based on our interpretation of a physiological event, a physiological response, based on our knowledge and our culture. Pragmatics is just how much of a dependence a language requires on pre-developed knowledge. Maladaptive coping technique is something that reduces the symptom but don't actually not cures or even strengthens the actual disorder. Dissociation, forgetting the probable stress, researching about the stress ahead of time to avoid it, relying on something to forget to deal with stress, avoiding the stress at all costs, and running away. Left syndrome is a coping technique used by minority students and trying to fit it into a dominant culture in which low minority students put in minimal effort because they know that they are discriminated against by dominant cultures. And that does it. Nice.